Hello, everybody, and welcome again. This is our second workshop of our two virtual workshops with Perennial in St. Louis. Thank you so much to Tara again for joining us. And thank you to all of you for tuning in. I hope you're ready to do some more stitching. So I will go over again just the few little tech troubleshooting things in case we have some people here with us that weren't here for the beginning workshop. If you have a question, you can use the Zoom Q&A to submit your question. If you're watching on Facebook, you can also comment on that live stream and we will make sure to relay your question to Tara. You can also use the Zoom chat to talk with us as well as the other attendees. Note that you do have the option of who you are sending your message to in Zoom. I think the default is all panelists, so make sure to select to all panelists and attendees if you're looking to chat with the other attendees in the audience. Just wanted to point out two other really cool programs that we have going on this month. We have the Carbondale Public Library Poetry Contest. Anyone, any age group can submit any type of poem during the month of April, and we will start voting in May. You can send in a PDF of a poem, verse, sonnet, whatever you want. Also blackout poetry, magnetic poetry, totally up to you. We have several different age categories, so you'll select that on the Google form. When you submit your poem. If you have any problems with the Google form, you can also just email me. You can find that information online at carbondalepubliclibrary.org/poetry contest. It's also on Facebook. It's also on our main page, our homepage, so you can find it there. We also have April's Kids Take and Make Craft Kit. It includes everything that you need to welcome spring by creating your own bee painting. That's going to be a lot of fun. And thanks to Francine, our children's librarian, for putting that together. I, by the way, am our teen and youth librarian at Carbondale Public Library. My name is Liz. And if you have any questions about programs for teen or youth, just get in touch. And you can get in touch with Francine for our children's programs. And without further ado, hello, Francine. Yes, she's here with us too today. And without further ado, we will get on to Tara. Thank you so much again for being here with us. And I'm looking forward to getting even better with my sewing skills. Thanks so much, Tara. Take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Liz. Thanks for that lovely introduction and for highlighting all the really cool programs you guys have going on. So my name's Tara, and I am the program director at a nonprofit in St. Louis called Perennial. And if you haven't heard of us, we're all about showing folks how to make stuff with upcycled supplies. So we really want to teach folks DIY skills with a focus on sustainability and creative reuse. So we're going to be learning a couple, if maybe you were in that beginner's workshop this morning and we kind of covered some really basic stuff about threading a needle, tying a knot, doing a running stitch, doing a patch, and adding a button. We're going to kind of take those skills and jump to the next level today. We're going to learn how to do a backstitch. We're going to learn how to do an invisible stitch, and we are going to kind of just learn some tips and tricks for cutting, pinning, ironing our fabric, especially if you kind of begin to work on projects that work from a pattern. These are great skills to have just to kind of take your learning to the next level. A little bit later on, I'm going to add a overhead screen when we do our stitches, but I kind of want to start off just using the screen to talk a little bit about fabric selection and ironing and prepping our fabric. So if you did pick up a kit, and if you're tuning in because you picked up a kit, I'm imagining that you got some squares of a cotton fabric. It probably doesn't look like this. This is just some fabric that I grabbed around the shop. Now, when you're selecting fabric for whatever project that you're going to work on, sometimes, you might be working with salvage fabric or something where you don't really know the fiber content. You don't know what the material is. Sometimes you can really, as you become more familiar with working with different types of fabric, you can make a good educated guess as to what it is. Like the fabric that I have here, it's a woven fabric, meaning it has threads going vertically and horizontally. And I can see that if I really look up close. So I encourage you to really kind of look at the fibers. Most woven fabrics are going to be a cotton or a cotton blend. Another woven fabric that you might encounter is linen, which is going to have a really visible weave. It's usually a little bit more open. Sometimes it's kind of gappy. It's a little bit more breathable. Maybe you have some like a linen tablecloth or curtains or something. Linen is also great to work with. Those are both natural fibers. Cotton sometimes has blends with it. So a lot of times you'll see like a cotton polyester blend. And this will matter when we're thinking about preparing our fabric for our project, whatever project we might want to work on. It will affect our ironing and our washing of the fabric. So you guys probably know if you've bought a garment before that cotton shrinks. And if you really want to kind of be a next level sewer, what is often what I recommend to folks is before you begin a project, whatever fabric you have chosen, go ahead and wash it first. Now that means that you're not going to have like the nice, beautiful, crisp fabric that maybe you bought from a store, but washing it first is going to basically pre-shrink it so that you don't have to deal with any weird goobers that might happen as you're putting your piece together. You'll see that it might change if you wash it afterwards. So if I'm working on a garment or something, or a tote or anything that I might wash later, if you know that it's something that you're probably not going to wash, don't worry about it. You can work with the fabric as is. Now, I often recommend to folks, since we are a reuse organization, some things that are really great to work with and are very affordable for getting a lot of material is kind of jumping over to a thrift store. We have a Goodwill outlet here in St. Louis. I don't know if Carbondale has one, but it's pay by the pound. So you can work with things like bed sheets. They're awesome to work with because they're dirt cheap and you can get lots of fabric that way. So it's really great for making lots of project with. And they are going to have a label still attached to them that tells you that fiber content. It's going to tell you what it's made of. So that's really wonderful to know before you begin a project. Whereas sometimes if you're buying salvaged fabric, you just don't know what that fiber content is. Now, there is something that you could do to fabric. I'm not going to demonstrate it for you today, but I will kind of talk about it. There is something you can do if you really need to know what the material is, but you're just not sure. You can do what's called a burn test, which is if you have some excess fabric, basically you literally just burn a little piece of it. And by watching the way that it reacts, and you can find guides online for kind of what you're looking for. But typically if it's a natural fiber, like wool, silk, or cotton, it's going to have a better burn. It's not really going to melt. It's going to char. Whereas synthetic fabrics like a polyester or acrylic, because they are actually made with plastics, they're going to have more of a melty look and have a different smell to them. You would, of course, want to do that in a very controlled and safe environment. But if you need to know, like if you're doing some dyeing, for example, you really need to know that fiber content and just aren't sure, that's a really good thing to do. So this also matters because, well, sorry, let me back up and say, I recommend washing that fabric before even cutting it out if you are cutting a pattern, because the fabric will tend to fray a little bit when you wash it. So if you cut something out, not only will it shrink, but it'll have a little bit of fray. So it won't be exactly what you had in mind. But it also matters for our iron settings. So if you have an iron at home, go ahead and grab it, take a look at it. We're going to notice that our iron is really going to give us a lot of information. It's going to tell us what it's able to do. But typically you'll be able to see, mine is really hidden here on the inside, but it goes from synthetic, silk, wool, cotton, and linen. And that's tells me that the linen is my max. So that's going to get the maximum amount of heat. Whereas synthetic is going to be very low because, as I told you, if you do a burn test with synthetic or plasticky fabrics, they do tend to melt. So we want to keep that heat really low. Whereas our cotton and our linen, they can withstand a lot more heat. So it's important to use the right setting on the iron so that you don't accidentally melt your fabric or fuse it to your ironing board or just damage it in some way. When we use our iron, we want to keep it moving the whole time. And then typically your iron will have, mine is very hard to see by a zoom, but I have a steam setting and I have a spray setting. I tend to prefer, most of the time, especially for really wrinkly fabrics, using spray. Steam works well on kind of lightly wrinkled fabrics, but it's going to be much more gentle. So just keep that in mind. And I'm going to demonstrate both. So I'm going to go ahead and get my iron all plugged in, and it's going to start to heat up pretty quickly. I do have a piece of fabric that I already ironed, and it looks pretty good. I got a lot of the wrinkles out really quickly. And I'm going to grab one that's much more wrinkled. It's not looking so good. And I'm going to get my iron plugged in. And I'm working in our wood shop here because we're open to the public in our main shop. So you might see some woodworking stuff in the background. But I'm actually using, as my ironing board, I'm using a piece of wool fabric. Mind me getting my iron plugged in. If you don't have an ironing board at home, this is just an old wool blanket. And this works really, really well for... sorry, I'm going to tilt that a little bit. This works great as an ironing board because it's easy to pack up and put away. It's very portable, and it gets really big too. So if you're working with a really large piece of fabric, if you're making a garment or something, this is really easy to work with. You can work with a traditional ironing board, of course. And you can work with like wool pressing mats. They make those now. That's basically like a thick piece of compact wool. A lot of quilters you'll see will use these. I have one of those at home. That's typically what I use because it's easy to pack up and put away. Unfortunately, my cats really love it too, so I have to protect it. My iron heats up really, really quickly. So mine's already hot. I'm gonna go ahead and use that spray setting. And I've got a square of fabric. If you picked up a kit, you probably have a 10-inch square of fabric. We'll start there. I'm just gonna lay that down. And I'm gonna use that spray setting, like I told you guys, and it's literally going to just kind of squirt some water on the fabric. Oops. You can see, maybe you can't, but I've got kind of like watermarks all over my fabric. Now I can go ahead and iron that pretty immediately. I'm keeping that iron moving. This was a cotton blend fabric, so that's the setting that I'm using. Keeping it moving, and it irons up really, really quickly and nicely. So I'm gonna do that for both of my pieces of fabric. If I steam it, I'm gonna go ahead and switch to steam. You see that kind of puff that happens there? Steam still works pretty well. On this piece of fabric, it's really ironing out really well, but sometimes it's just a little bit more gentle. And so you'll find that if you have very stubborn wrinkles, definitely use the spray setting. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and unplug my iron, leave it off to the side. And we're gonna go back to this view here. Now I've got my squares of fabric ready to go. And we're gonna do kind of a small project here that's going to demonstrate several different stitches. Before I dig into those stitches too much, I wanna talk about some tools that I really like for my sewing projects. So if you were in that first workshop, I recommended that you get a nice pair of Dressmaker Shears. This brand here is Ginger. I've also used Mundial. Fiskars make some good ones too. You can find these at a craft store. They do tend to cost a good deal, but they're really, really sharp, and they're going to give you lovely, clean cuts. If you really get into sewing projects, having a nice rotary cutter is also wonderful. So this has kind of a rotating blade. I like to describe this tool as like a pizza cutter for fabric. I just drop that blade guard and expose the blade. Now with this, I'm able to pretty quickly and easily cut my fabric as long as it's on a cutting mat. That's kind of the next tool that I really love. A self-healing cutting mat. And it's labeled as self-healing because it can withstand a lot of scratches. The one that I'm using is really well loved and well used. It's great to have underneath. If you have a rotary cutter, but you don't have something like a self-healing cutting mat, you could use something like a piece of cardboard underneath, but it is going to dull your blade. And keeping these blades sharp is going to make sure that it stays safe for much longer. In the first workshop, I also recommended that you have a small pair of thread snips, different than your fabric scissors that's just designed for cutting your thread. It's nice and ergonomic to have a small pair, and it also helps extend the life of these blades here by using this on your polyester thread. And then the last thing, which I'm going to show you how we use later, is a set of pinking shears. So these have a little kind of zigzag, and these are great, particularly for making garments or for making totes or stockings or whatever sort of pattern you might be working at, because when we fold something inside out, this is going to, it's going to do two things. It's going to help prevent fraying of the edges of our fabric by having a zigzag there. It helps prevent fraying. It also is a way, once we do a stitch, to cut close to that stitch line in a way that's safe and will allow something to turn inside out really nicely. If we're working with different rulers to trace our pattern onto our fabric, I really love using just normal chalk. This is just school chalk. There's also a little bit of like tailor's chalk in here too, but it's eco-friendly and it wipes off and washes off very easily too. You can definitely use things like fabric markers or even just normal markers. But they're going to be, well, markers like this will be permanent. So you'd want to only use that on parts of the fabric that you're going to cut off. So cutting on the inside of that line. But if you're using fabric markers, typically they wash off. The only thing I don't love about fabric markers is it just uses a lot of plastic. So that's why I really love chalk, is it just, it's going to, you're going to get to use it until it runs out of material. Now, last tool you might want is some type of ruler. And I'm going to show you a couple of different types. I'm showing you this one because it's small, but I have a I have a big quilting ruler here too. These quilting rulers are like a clear acrylic, and they are see-through so that you're able to kind of square up your fabric and see what's going on underneath. And you can run that rotary blade right against these. So I can kind of use this as an edge and run my rotary blade right alongside this. The only thing, oh, I put it away too soon. The only thing I don't love about this type of tool is it can be a little bit slippery. There are kind of like suction cup handles you can get to help hold this in place, but they still slide on your fabric just a little bit. So the other tool that I really like using are cork-backed metal rulers. They're going to stay really nice and true, and they do grip to your fabric a little bit easier. For quilting projects that maybe you're just cutting out these squares to do like half square triangle quilts or something like that, it is nice to have something like this, but this is a really great and affordable tool that you can get that is less slippery and will kind of stay in place. So if I were to use this with my cutting mat, let's pretend, oh, I'm going to kind of mess up my fabric, I guess. I'm going to kind of, oh, I got something goofy going on. Let's pretend that I have some fabric that has a really messy edge, and I want to square this up. Typically, you want your fabric to have a nice square edge here. Then I might, actually, I'm going to turn it this way so I'm able to use it a little bit more comfortably. If I have at least one square side, which for me, these two sides are really nice and square, I'm going to line them up with the gridded marks on my cutting mat underneath. And I'm going to go ahead and line this up with the lines that I can see on my cutting mat. And I could use my rotary cutter to cut this really easily. I do like to use my rotary cutter typically when I'm standing up, but I did it sitting down just now. Or if I don't have a rotary cutter, the other thing I can do is still square up my fabric, but I can just, again, draw a line with chalk. So I'm going to just draw a blue line there, which is right at that edge. And then I can use my fabric scissors and cut just on the inside of that line. Now, when you're using fabric scissors to cut rather than a rotary cutter, I do recommend keeping your strokes as long as possible.
I do see we have a question, Tara, and I'm so sorry if I didn't catch you answering this, are you supposed to cut along the grain or against the grain?
That's a wonderful question. In most projects, you are going to cut with the grain of the fabric. So in the same direction as one of those weaves. Now, when you don't cut with the grain of the fabric, so if I cut at a diagonal, that is called cutting with the bias. So you might have seen at a craft store something called bias tape, and that is fabric that is cut at a diagonal. And when you cut with the bias, it's particularly used for things like necklines or really things that need to be kind of flexible that fit a curve. So again, like necklines, because since it goes against those two weaves, it's going to be able to curve a lot more easy. So for most general purposes, you're going to be cutting with the grain. So I'm so glad you asked that. I'm always happy to answer questions like that.
Thank you, Tara.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I think that we're ready in just a moment to actually get started with some sewing. So if you are participating at home, you probably would have gotten a kit with a couple of squares of fabric. I think I had that you guys should get like 3 squares of fabric, but I think I'm going to try and combine all of our stitches onto the same fabric and just have us basically do something like a pouch that we're going to turn inside out so that we can learn how to do the back stitch on 2 sides. We're going to turn it inside out and learn about clipping our corners and using those pinking shears or doing wiggled cuts. And we're going to seal it up with an invisible stitch. So you could, just so that you have a little less sewing to do, I think I said a 10-inch square is what should be in your kit, but you could definitely trim it down a little bit more. So I'm going to grab one of my 10-inch squares that I went ahead and prepped for myself. And I'm going to have it with the good side, so the side of the fabric that's printed facing up for me right now. And I'm just going to fold it over in one direction. So I should have a rectangle now. Dropped my thread earlier and just went ahead and grabbed it. So once you get this rectangle, again, this is probably about 10 inches wide for you right now. I'm going to have you shorten it up just a little bit so that we have a little less sewing to do to make sure we can get through all of our sewing today. So I'm going to have us take about, let's see what this is, about 3 inches off of the end, maybe. That'll be perfect. So you can kind of, if you have a ruler, if you have chalk, you can test out some of your new skills and measure, mark, and cut, or use a rotary cutter if you happen to have something like that. The other thing I want to show you, which if you were in the morning workshop, I already showed you, is you can also measure it and do just a small snip wherever you want that to, wherever you want the line to be. And with a woven fabric like this one, you can rip it really easily. And sometimes that'll go a little bit off course, but as long as you kind of squared your fabric up against that grain, it should go directly against it. Okay, so now I've got a nice small rectangle here. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and set up my overhead camera so that I'll be able to show you guys these stitches pretty quickly and nicely from on top. So hang tight for just a moment. If you weren't quite there with your cutting of your fabric, you'll have a moment to put in. Oh, let's turn that around. Okay. Oh, accidentally turned it off. So easy to hit those buttons on the side when you're setting that up. Okay, so I believe Liz will probably spotlight that video. I'm gonna have 2 views, so you'll still be able to see this other view, but I do recommend that you kind of switch to that top-down view of my hands. Liz, do you mind I think the spotlight is on this other one.
I accidentally had 2 pins going. Thank you so much.
Okay. I think for me, it's still showing this one spotlighted. I would like for this one to be spotlighted.
Absolutely. Yes, give me 1
Oh,
second. I'm sorry about that.
I'm rushing you.
I will, but you feel free to get moving along. I will take care of this. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Okay, so we should have a little rectangle here. Okay, awesome. Yeah, I'm seeing that really nicely now. And what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to do a back stitch along 2 of these edges. Then we're going to flip this inside out. Whenever we're doing some sort of pattern, typically you do want your right side, so your printed sides facing together like we did. And then so that way our seams are hidden on the inside and we're able to flip it inside out. If you do happen to have a ruler and chalk, you could go ahead and draw yourself some guidelines here for where I want to do my line of stitching, which I like to do about 1/4 of an inch from the edge. So I could go ahead and draw that line. If you don't have that, that's okay. Won't be the end of the world. I'm going to do it just on one side for myself so that you're able to see my stitches really clearly on the other side. And we're going to start stitching at this side that's folded here. We're going to stitch from this side to this one, and then we'll come back and sew that sew that open side over here. I'm going to be using a contrasting color thread so that it's easy for you guys to see. And I'm going to rethread my needle. Now we're doing a back stitch. So if you were with me in that first workshop, we did a running stitch, which is kind of just a really basic up-down stitch. I'm going to grab my sample from that. That's what a running stitch looks like. A back stitch is going to look like just a straight line on one side. It's going to look a little bit messier on the other side, but it's basically just going to look like a straight line. This is going to mimic the effect of a sewing machine more closely. So we want to do a back stitch on something that needs a little bit more structure, on something that it really needs the strength and durability. Now again, if you're with us in the first workshop, I'm going to clip my thread at a 45-degree angle. I'm going to use a little bit of moisture to get it going. I've got my thread sticking out of my finger. I can go ahead and coax my needle onto my thread. Got it on the second pass. Sometimes it doesn't, oh, and then I pulled it right out. Sometimes it doesn't happen immediately, and that's okay. Especially if you need your reading glasses or something like that, it can take a minute to get that ready. But, so what I wanted to go back to, because I haven't told you how much thread to cut off, when we did a running stitch, because it just goes up, down, it ends up that we need about the same length of thread as the length of the 2 surfaces that we're sewing, plus about 6 inches extra or so for us to kind of tie off our knots. Now, when we're doing a back stitch, we're going to end up kind of doubling back on our stitches quite a bit. So it's going to need about double. So if I were to kind of measure along those 2 sides, double it over, and then add an extra 6 inches. I'm pretty much there with the piece that I had already cut off, but just use your material to kind of measure that out, okay? In case you cut yours a little bit differently than mine. Now, again, if you were with us in that first workshop, we kind of went over a quick way to tie a knot at the end, because I do have my needle here with a short tail of thread, and then a really long tail of thread. We do have a little bit longer of a thread for this project. Now, as a reminder of how to quickly kind of tie a knot at the end, I'm pinching because I am right-handed. I'm doing this with my left hand. I've got my needle here. I'm going to grab the end of that really long tail, and I'm going to place it in the same spot, going behind the needle. Swing it towards me 3 times, 3, around the needle. Coax those threads together. Grab it with my finger. And then just slide it through to the end until you get a little knot down there. Oh, grab some of my hairs in there too. Hopefully that doesn't happen for you. But I've got a little knot here. If that didn't work out for you, you can absolutely just do a knot by kind of making a loop around your finger and kind of coaxing that knot into place there. Okay, so to begin our back stitch, we're actually going to start very similar to how we started our running stitch. It just starts with the running stitch. I'm going to go from underneath my fabric. I'm going to go pretty close to the edge here. And I'm kind of landing on that line that I drew, that 1/4 inch from the edge. I don't want to go right next to the edge with my stitching. I'm leaving that little bit of space so that I'm not right close to the edge of that fraying fabric. This is what you would do on a sewing machine too. It's called seam allowance. So if you see a pattern refer to something as seam allowance, that's what it's talking about. All right, so let's go ahead and go up a stitch length. And if you were with me in that first workshop, I've kind of washed off most of my marks, but you can keep your stitches pretty consistent by drawing a couple of dashes on your thumb. I tend to go a little bit quicker than that, so I don't have the patience to sit there and measure them. So just kind of, you can also eyeball it. Okay, so I'm going down a stitch length. I'm just starting my first stitch here. And as of right now, I'm going to grab that short tail and I'm going to kind of pull it back so that I don't have so much thread to pull through, and I will adjust that as I go. All right, so I have started one stitch. That's all I have right now. This is how we start a running stitch. It's also how we start a back stitch. Now what I want to do is I want to go up the same way that I would start a running stitch, go up a stitch length, come from the back, but instead of going forward, I'm going to go back into the same hole that my previous stitch exited from. So that hole right there, right next to that stitch, that's where I'm going to pull my needle in. And you see that it starts to look like just a straight line. Oh, that's not very well focused. There we go. But that's what it's going to look like. On the back, it's going to get a little bit messier because we're going to have threads kind of doubled over next to each other. But this is going to be a very strong stitch. So just keep your stitches in line as best as possible. Go back to that same hole that I just exited from. And now if we take a look at the back, again, you can see that my threads are kind of doubled over next to each other. I know that's not 100% visible, but this is a back stitch. Not too tricky, but very strong. Like I said, it kind of mimics the effect of a sewing machine. This is what a sewing machine is effectually doing. Okay, so we'll just continue all the way up both sides. And this is why I wanted you to kind of make your fabric a little bit smaller than what I initially recommended for your kit, because it does take a little bit of time. You can kind of streamline your stitching, kind of go in and out in one fell swoop. So it's a little bit hard to see. I'm going to kind of change my angle here, but I can kind of pull my needle partway through and then go down into this hole so that I just have one pull through motion rather than two. Don't pull too hard. You see that how I just pulled there, it started to kind of crinkle my fabric. I definitely don't want that. We want it to lay flat. Okay, so just keep it, keep your tension. That's what that would be. Keep your tension even. And I'm at the point here, this is where my thread was doubled over. It's getting pretty close that my short tail could get lost in my stitches if I don't pull it up. So if I just kind of tug my needle a little bit, that short tail will kind of go up a little bit. And that's what we want to do as we sew so that we keep the length of thread that we're working with at a reasonable amount. The length of thread that we're sewing with today is pretty long. Typically, you don't want to sew with something that's too long because it has a tendency to get tangled much more frequently. And it's just tricky. It's just trickier to do. So if you're finding that it's really challenging for you, it's much better to work with shorter lengths of thread and start and stop your stitches more frequently. That's okay. All right, how are we looking on time? We're looking good. So I want to get us to this side and down the other side. If we need to trim down our fabric a little bit more, we can. And actually the second stitch that I'm going to show you, the invisible stitch, that one is a really helpful one to learn for, I've used it in particular for mending a rip in a pillow at my house that kind of tore open at the seams, but it's great for anything that you need to kind of close off and want to have that end stitch invisible. That's why it's called that invisible. You'll see it referred to a couple of different ways, as an invisible blind ladder stitch or a slip stitch. It's all the same. I don't know why it has so many names. Just different, probably different regions and cultures have kind of learned the same stitch throughout time. Okay, so it's looking like a straight line. Like I said, on the back side, it's a little bit messier just because I have that overlap, but overall, that chalk line that I drew is really helping me to keep it straight. No worries if you didn't draw a chalk line. I also think it's easier in general to keep a back stitch straighter than it is a running stitch because you're always kind of doubling back to where you exited. It's going to help it read as a more continuous line, even if it has some small wiggle to it throughout. And I'm getting to a point here where I'm about to turn the corner. So I want to make sure that I save 1/4 inch from this edge. I actually have kind of a gridded line on my fabric. That's just part of the line that was there. I didn't do that intentionally, but I'm going to kind of follow it. Oh, and I'm at the point too where I'm about to lose that short tail in my thread. So I'm pulling it again. Make sure that doesn't happen to you. It'll be really hard to get out later if you don't notice that that's happening. I talked a little bit in the first workshop about how embroidery hoops can help you to just to kind of maintain a little bit of tension. If you're having trouble kind of holding all this in your hands, definitely consider using an embroidery hoop, but for a project like this, it's definitely not necessary. And if you get a knot, it can be very hard to undo a knot. So honestly, the best thing to do is to just cut it out, cut your losses. Don't get too frustrated with it. You'll spend more time trying to undo a knot than it would be to just to start a new one. So if you don't know how to close off a stitch yet, I'll get to that momentarily, but definitely let me know. Let me get some of my loose threads here out of the way. Definitely let me know in the chat if anyone gets ahead of me and they need to know how to close off a stitch and I haven't shown it. All right. So I'm about to turn my corner. So I'm going to go down the other direction and work my way back. Okay. So what we're going to end up making is basically just a little closed off pouch. It really won't be, because we're going to close it off, something totally usable. But you could not close it all the way off, and you could add something like rice or buckwheat to the inside, and this makes for like a great, kind of the shape of this, a great little like, not muscle relaxer, like a little heating pad that you can, yeah, kind of use to help with muscular aches and pains. Kind of peeked at the chat and I'm not seeing any questions so far, so I'm hoping that this back stitch is going okay for you guys. I think it's not too tricky.
Hey, Tara, we did have a question about why you have your fabric folded with the right sides together.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So the project that we're doing, basically we're going to end up turning it inside out. So when we put our right sides together, it's because we want to hide our seams on the ugly side. We want to hide our seams on the inside so that when we turn this inside out, we are going to have the good side as what we're able to see. So many projects will use the language of right sides together or wrong sides together. So just pay attention to that if you're reading a pattern in the future. But yeah, anything that you're turning inside out, you always want those right sides facing each other so that this stitch will be invisible. If you've seen like cute little handmade plushies that were like stitched on the outside, they just had wrong sides together. So I'm getting a little low on my thread here, so I'm probably gonna close off my stitch here in a moment, and then I might actually just cut my fabric off and have us just work with a little bit smaller of a piece just so you guys can kind of craft along. And you know, I'm so sorry I forgot to do this. We did this in the first workshop, but it's also really helpful as you work to, of course, pin your fabric together, which the best way to do this is to pin your fabric perpendicular to what you're going to be sewing. This does mean that you'll pull pins out as you go, but particularly if you're working with a sewing machine, this is the easiest way to work because if I'm sewing here, I'm able to easily pull these pins out as I go. Whereas if I'm sewing and my pin is going parallel to what I'm sewing, it gets actually really tricky to, when this is flat against the sewing machine, to kind of get in here and pull this out. So I strongly recommend that. There's also things called clips. Oh, I unthreaded my needle because I was goofing around. Clips will kind of just pinch the edges together so that you don't have to pin it all. That's especially helpful for thick projects, like if you're working with denim or canvas or leather or something like that, where it's really challenging to pin through all that material. Clips are really great. Quilters will use those a lot too. All right, I'm gonna pause here looking at our time. I just wanna make sure we have enough time to learn our last stitch. And I'm just gonna cut off our fabric. We'll work with a little baby piece here. And I wanna close off my stitch. So I'm gonna go ahead and do one more little stitch here and get to my back side. And if you were in that first workshop, I showed you how to close off a stitch. It is a little bit harder to see this on, let me pull my pin out here. It's a little bit harder to see this on the back stitch because we have so many threads happening on this side. But basically what we're looking to do is to slide horizontally underneath our previous stitch. And at the moment, I'm going away from my body. And before I pull that all the way through, I see a little loop is forming. I'm going to swing my needle back through that loop towards my body and then coax a little knot into place here. And I'm going to do that one more time. So slide that needle horizontally, pull that needle back towards my body. And I've got my stitch closed off. Okay. And I could use my little snips here to trim that off, leaving about 1/4 of an inch or so. So before I turn this inside out and we learn how to do the invisible stitch along this top side, well, first of all, I could continue back stitching here and only do an invisible stitch on a small section. Did I hear a sound? Oh, sorry. I thought I heard someone with a question.
I think we're good. Thank you so much,
Oh,
Tara.
okay. So I could keep stitching and then just leave a small part and turn this inside out. But just to keep it simple on you guys, I'm going to have us do that whole side as one stitch. So typically, knowing that I'm going to turn this inside out, and it would be like a small little kind of pouch here, you can see that like my corners look a little goofy right now. I haven't fully popped them out, but I do want to go in and clean up my corners to the best of my ability to help it to pop out really nicely. And typically what you want to do on a project like this is clip your corners at a 45-degree angle. And I just happen to be using my little thread scissors, but you can use your nice big scissors. Clip those corners at a 45-degree angle to help that corner release a little bit easier. You see how I left some space here. The other thing that you'll typically want to do, this is where pinking shears are really helpful, because I can come in really pretty close to my stitch here and do that pinking shear cut. This is again going to help prevent fraying. Also, when we turn this with the right sides out, this is going to help so that we don't have so much bulky fabric here. Now, if you don't have pinking shears, you can kind of mimic the effect with your scissors just by kind of rocking back and forth, creating some little triangles. And I definitely had to do this before I had pinking shears. Pinking shears definitely make your life a little bit easier, but I can kind of mimic that effect at a larger scale there, okay? So either way is totally acceptable.
Hey, Tara, have you ever had success with some of those? I know there are some products that you can put on any fraying ends. I personally in the past have used clear nail polish sometimes.
Ooh, interesting, interesting. You know, for buttonholes in particular, if you're sewing a buttonhole, I have found that like those fray end fabrics are really, fray end kind of liquids are really helpful. But for something like this, it's not a big, I mean, it's going to get hidden on the inside. It's not really a big worry. So I haven't found a super need for it, but clear nail polish is a hot tip.
Cheaper too.
Yeah, that's true. So your corners should pop out a little bit more nicely since we clipped them. You could use something like a bamboo skewer or a knitting needle or something to kind of help you pop those out even more if need be. Now, typically at this stage, you might also kind of press here. I'm just going to keep us moving along, though. I know this is it's a funny little pocket, isn't it? Someone said, what a cute little pocket. It's not really going to be, we're not making anything in particular. We're working pretty small scale. Now I want to show the blind ladder stitch. Now I'm using, again, red thread so that you can see it against my light fabric, but ideally you guys are using a fabric that hides your work a little bit more so that it helps it to be invisible. So to do an invisible stitch, what I need to do, you can kind of see with my little pocket, I'm kind of folding in from two sides. What I want to do is my raw edges of fabric, so I'm looking at my pouch kind of from the top, these raw edges of fabric here need to tuck down. I basically need to create that same kind of seam allowance, but we're going to do it from the outside this time. We're going to do that invisible stitch. So I definitely want you to pin here. So we're going to tuck those towards each other, grab a couple of pins, and just use it to hold these in place. And I'm folding these over about 1/4 inch. It might be a little bit more. You can definitely like measure and press this so that it's exact. But we're cruising along. Okay, get my needle, my pins to lie flat. So those are folded in towards each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a stitch that bridges this gap and brings both of these sides together. Again, typically you want to use a thread that's going to blend in with that a little bit more. I'm going to use a red thread so you can see it, but we'll still get a really nice effect from this. So I'm going to get about 1.5 the length here. I'm going to thread my needle again. I'll do my knot here on the end. Actually, I'll show you that trick again. I do tend to tie my knot a little bit differently, but pinch this in my finger, hold that behind the needle, wrap around 1, 2, 3 times, pinch all those together, and slide it down. to this end here. Oops, I didn't get a good one that time. Let's try it one more time. Sometimes you get a messy one. I probably didn't pinch that. I didn't bundle that a little bit. I didn't bundle it close enough when I pinched it together. I was kind of going kind of quick. All right, let's bundle that up a little bit better. Pinch those. And now I've got it. Okay. All right, so this tail, I want to make sure it gets hidden on the inside. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to come out the corner here. I'm going to come right out from the inside. So I'm starting on the inside of my opening, and I'm working my way towards the outside, and then tuck that tail in. We want it to hide here on the inside. Mine's being really stubborn. There we go. Okay. So to cinch this up, see if I can get in focus here. I'm going to end up doing, reason that they call this a ladder stitch is I'm going to grab a little bit of thread from this side and then go horizontally across and grab a little bit of fabric from this side. I didn't mean to say thread, I meant to say fabric. So I'm going to dip in here. I came out a little bit low here. I recommend that you come out a little bit higher. So I'm going to kind of correct myself and come up a little bit higher here so that I'm closer to the end. So I've got my two sides of fabric that I want to bring together. So on one side, I'm going to start with the side away from my body first. I'm going to just quickly dip my needle in and out, pull it through. And now where it exited, I'm going to go straight across, so perfectly horizontal, and then go to the other side, dip my needle in and out, just like a short stitch length here. Oh, doesn't look great on screen. There we go. Pull that through. So I should see like a little horizontal line going across. You can see that. So it's going to continue that way and look like a ladder. So I want to bring that thread horizontally over here and go in and out again. So I could have it even as open as I have it right now. Keep going up. And I do actually have on our YouTube channel, I have like a really quick video that shows this kind of at super speed that I can link you guys to. So I kind of get those little ladder rungs here. And I just continue that rhythm. Dip in and out and always go straight across. That's what makes it the ladder stitch. And that's how it's going to become invisible too. We'll see if you're able to see my red thread at all, because it's very contrasty against my fabric right now. So like I said, this is really great for, oops, I grabbed both sides. I don't want to do that. This is really great for finishing a project that, like, maybe it's a little stuffed animal or something that you sewed from the inside and you turned inside out. It's just a great little finishing stitch so that you can hide your work. So those are my little ladder rungs that I've got going on. They're just going right along the top here. Got some that are kind of bubbled out. I'm not worried about that yet because we actually pull our thread at the end, and that's what brings it together. So don't worry about pulling too much as you go. Oh, it looks like Liz might have already found that video and linked you guys in the chat, which is awesome. Yeah. So please definitely watch that and refer back to it later. It kind of shows the whole process at hyperspeed. I think it's only like a 45-second video or something.
There's a bunch of cool videos on there to check out for sure.
Yeah, we've kind of been working over the past year to kind of build up our content. So it's been slow and steady there. One of my favorites on there is cutting t-shirt yarn, which if you have some of the tools that we talked about today, like a rotary cutter and a cutting mat, you can cut your t-shirts into yarn very easily. And it's awesome. It's a great way to upcycle those shirts that often kind of get overlooked in thrift stores. I don't know if we have a lot of other sewing projects on there, but we have a lot of other just kind of general upcycled crafts on there. Okay. I'm probably gonna clip my stitch a little bit sooner. I didn't make it to the end, but I wanna make sure you guys can see the end result. I thought we were working small enough that we'd have time, but at least me, I'm a slow stitcher. Maybe you guys are too, especially as you're learning. Someone has a question. If I send in a picture, can you help me to reproduce a project? The person originally, oh no. Yeah, I can absolutely do my best. Sometime, I'll provide my email, but yeah, I can do my best to help you out. I would love to.
Would you like me to throw that in the chat for you, Tara?
Sure, yeah, that's fine.
Will do.
That helps me while I'm stitching away. Okay, looking at the time, I'm gonna go ahead and end off my stitch here. And typically you wanna make it all the way to the other side. I wanna get this to come into focus here, but it just doesn't want to. Come on, camera. Okay, so once you finish stitching, what you would then do is, it just doesn't look good. So I might actually, oh no, that's working. So then you give your thread a pull. I don't know if you guys could hopefully see that kind of magic that happened there. As I pulled it, it brought both of those sides together. And I do have that filmed version on that YouTube video that maybe will be a little bit clearer than my dumb camera wants to be right now. But even my red thread really disappeared. This is why this is an invisible stitch. So you can close off your stitch in the same way that we had done before, kind of tuck it underneath one of your previous stitches. And I want to show you how to hide your tail end here too. So let me get mine into that same place to be able to show you that. I ended mine a little too soon. So mine's going to be a little bit goofy. Let's say we were going to stuff this with something and we were closing it off. Okay, so once I close off my stitch, I want to, and ideally this would be at a little corner and it would be similar to the color palette that you're working on, because this is the one area that we can kind of see it. But what I want to do is I want to go back into the project. So poke your needle in right next to where you ended and then poke it back out about an inch or so away from the inside. So I, again, went down right next to that knot, pull my needle through towards the inside. And you see I've just exited kind of on a random part of my material. Go ahead and take your scissors, pull this a little bit, tuck or snip your thread off, and then just kind of loosen your fabric and that thread will disappear onto the inside. So that's how we get our thread to go onto the inside of whatever we're sewing. If we were to make it to the end and make this a little pouch like I wanted to, that's how we would hide that thread at the end. Okay, so keep working at it. Keep stitching away, but stitch truly does become almost invisible. It does kind of tend to create that little kind of bubbly or wavery effect. So I tend to reserve this stitch for kind of like a small section. So as I had kind of told you guys before, I could have back stitched about halfway through this, then turned it inside out, and then just done the ladder stitch on this little section. But I wanted to get to that ladder stitch sooner rather than later. That's how you do it. Okay, I'm going to switch back to my other camera and see if we have any questions or other thoughts that I've missed. Hopefully you guys that were trying to craft along. I know I kind of speed raced there at the end, but I really wanted to cover so much today.
And you did cover so much. Thank you so much. I learned myself today a few stitches that I have been a little bit too scared to try on my own. So thank you so much for that. And just a reminder to everybody in the audience, you will be able to see this on the Carbondale Public Library YouTube channel if there's something you need to go back and reference as you finish up a project. So, and yes, definitely check out Perennial's YouTube channel as well. There's some really cool stuff on there. I'm going to have to make some t-shirt yarn myself.
Nice, nice. Yeah, we love being able to provide some free content for you guys. And yeah, well, please check us out. Oh, it looks like Liz already linked our website there in the chat too. So yeah, feel free to find us and check out some of our classes. We do have a lot of virtual classes that people locally pick up kits for, but we have a lot too that you don't have to have a kit for to participate. So you could definitely participate from Carbondale.
Absolutely. And I would love to, I love the idea of perhaps a darning class, because that is another thing that I can imagine that a lot of people would be interested in. Who doesn't have a sweater that they love that has a hole in it?
We will be adding a darning and mending class this summer, so look out for that. And I'm also happy to, when folks reach out about having kits shipped to them, we're usually happy to accommodate that too. So it can usually happen.
That's so wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody in the audience, for being with us today. Hope you had a good time and hope you learned a lot. And thank you, Tara, for being with us. Thank you so much for doing this with us.
Thanks, Liz. You guys have a great rest of your afternoon.
You too. Everybody have a great afternoon. Bye.